Hello and welcome. You're listening to the American Interest Podcast with me, Richard Aldous. My guest this week is Ross Douthat, columnist at the New York Times and author of the new book, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. Ross, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back.
And congratulations on the new book. So how are we victims of our own success?
In the sense that we are a technologically advanced, extremely wealthy civilization that is running into problems that you run into when you hit the frontiers of wealth and technological proficiency and start to stagnate a bit and start repeating yourself a bit. So the book starts, I hope appropriately, with the moon landing in 1969 and basically makes the argument that whether it was a coincidence or not, that particular peak of human accomplishment happened at about the same time that all across the developed world, growth rates were about to start slowing down. People were about to start having fewer children, making societies steadily older and less entrepreneurial and creative. And government in the Western world, and particularly in the United States, was about to enter a long period that obviously continues to the present day of increasing sclerosis, in which it becomes harder and harder to pass legislation, implement sweeping reforms, and so forth. And finally, that was the moment when the baby boomers essentially were seizing cultural power. And the least statistically precise argument that I make in the book, the most, sort of by definition in the eye of the beholder, is that in culture, and especially maybe pop culture, we have become effectively the prisoners of the baby boom generation and haven't figured out a way to get beyond endless remakes and reboots and recyclings of entertainment properties that became popular when they were young.
Yeah, this is one of the really interesting things about the book. As you say, you start with Sputnik and the Apollo moon landing, and this period that you're talking about really seems to end with the Challenger explosion in 1986. And very often we think of decadence as being something, that chocolate cake was very decadent, for example, is one of the examples the wrong examples that you give in the book, the wrong use of the word. But it seems to me that you mean risk aversion as much as anything else.
Yes, and I want to say that, anyone who wants to use the term decadent to refer to chocolate cakes in Vegas has my permission. I'm obviously offering a somewhat idiosyncratic definition of the term, but I'm not alone in it. I'm basically stealing it and adapting it from the great cultural critic Jacques Barzun, who wrote a book called From Dawn to Decadence that came out about 20 years ago. But his idea, which is now, I suppose, my idea, is that decadent eras are not necessarily characterized by total moral depravity and orgies and sort of wild excess. And in fact, sometimes wild excess is a sign of, dynamism and vitality. And decadent periods are characterized much more by frustration, institutions that don't seem to work anymore, a loss of purpose, a loss of confidence in the future, and so on and so forth. And so, in the realm of sort of sensory pleasures, there are sort of the wild bacchanalian orgy is less decadent under my definition than, the 20-something man sitting alone at his computer looking at 17,000 varieties of pornography.
Yeah.
Which is much more, I think, the story of our own era. And so if you go back to the 70s, right, you have this period of sort of chaos and collapse in many ways in the Western world, certainly sort of dramatic social transformation, but with it a sort of sense that society was falling apart. You had, crime rates off the charts. You had rising rates of rape and sexual violence. It was sort of a peak for, things like the controversies you've had in France recently that have reminded everyone that in the 1970s, a lot of French intellectuals thought that they should argue that sex with minors needed to be rehabilitated or legalized and so on. That was the 70s. And I think you can reasonably argue that the 70s were more immoral by some measures than our own era. but they were also, I think, more interesting and dynamic and less sort of comfortably numb, which is, I think, much more where we've ended up today.
Yeah, and this sense of terrible coldness. At the beginning, you quote Auden on Imperial Rome. What fascinates and terrifies us about the Roman Empire is not that it finally went smash, but that it managed to last for 4 centuries without creativity, warmth, or hope. The implication is that that's modern America.
Yes, I mean I think Auden is slightly exaggerating for effect there, and obviously, there were pockets of creativity, hope, and warmth even in late Imperial Rome. And speaking as a Christian, I mean the story of late Imperial Rome from a Christian perspective is one of, in fact, dynamism, creativity, and growth. So it's important. The hopeful side of my analysis is that, first, that even under decadence, it's possible to have forms of flourishing and creativity, even if the larger society feels sterile and repetitive. And two, that, it's possible to at least hope that you can escape from decadence, that you can have a sort of, revolution from within that gets you out of this rut without having to pass through the barbarian invasions or, the coronavirus wipeout phase of civilization.
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? And you kind of, this is something that runs throughout the book, that there is a paradox in all of this, because on the one hand, you have the kind of decadent society that you've outlined, Barzoon, with economic stagnation, institutional decay, cultural and intellectual exhaustion. And yet there's also this profound sense that we're not even moving into a new era. We've moved into a new age, from industrialization to this new digital age that has seen innovation of the kind that in our lifetime we perhaps never thought we would ever see.
Yes, and this is in a way an important caveat, although I think it links into the broader story I'm telling. But there has been, I think, generally economic and technological stagnation in the Western world relative to a lot of the expectations of the period from 1940 through the 1960s. If you look at sort of the expectations of that era, it wasn't just that people were confidently planning missions to Jupiter and moon colonies and terraforming Mars. It was also things like energy. People expected that we would all have sort of pocket nuclear reactors powering our homes and garages and so on. And so a lot of things like that have obviously not come to pass. But the great exception is the internet and is sort of technologies of communication and simulation, where we don't have the starships from Star Trek, but we have the communicators, and we don't exactly have the computer, but in fact we have computers that are pretty much as powerful that we carry around in our pockets. So in that sense, there has been real innovation. It's just been concentrated in a particular sector, a particular set of industries, as opposed to being spread the way it was across the Industrial Revolution, across a lot of different sectors of the economy and society. So that change is real. Silicon Valley is the exception. But the exception, first, its exceptionalism is sort of proved every time people in Silicon Valley try to revolutionize something other than simulation and communication, right? So, you have a lot of money poured into sort of dot-com companies that are trying to do something outside the dot-com sphere, whether it's Elizabeth Holmes trying to revolutionize blood testing with Theranos, or WeWork trying to revolutionize office space and the built environment. And you have an awful lot of cases where that money seems to end up either in outright frauds or in companies that just aren't actually that profitable, aren't as transformative as they think they are. So that's one limit on it. But then the other point that I make in the book is that this one area of technology in certain ways feeds stagnation in other spheres, because it encourages people to inhabit and sort of play act in virtual worlds rather than doing work in the real world. And so politics, I think, is one obvious example where there's tremendous political energy in the Western world right now, whether it's, surrounding everything to do with Trump or Brexit or populism or the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. But much of that energy is poured into a kind of virtual politics. There's an academic named Eitan Hersh who wrote a book that came out after my book, so I don't quote it in the book, but it's very complimentary because, I mean, it complements the book with a E rather than an I. But he argues basically that the internet leads people into what he calls political hobbyism, where you have the illusion that by clicking on something or liking something or dragging a columnist you hate on Twitter, you have accomplished something politically in the real world. But in fact, at the same time, normal forms of mass organization have continued to languish in our era, and political parties are weak, and activist groups are actually weaker in certain ways than they used to be. And that plays out in other areas too. You have sort of pornography and Tinder as substitutes for romance, marriage, and childbearing. So I think there's an argument that our one area of non-decadent innovation feeds political and cultural stagnation in other ways.
And is it that it's the exception, or is it that it's an outlier, and that maybe Silicon Valley in the 21st century is the direction that we're heading, rather than the 18th century constitution that was imagined in a revolutionary kind of way by the founders?
I mean, it certainly seems to be where we're heading. The question is what it actually means. I mean, does it produce then some sort of actual revolution in governance, right? I mean, you can imagine a world where Silicon Valley leads to an age of referenda, right, where everybody's voting online and, legislatures are increasingly bypassed, and that would not be decadent, right? That would be genuinely revolutionary and transformative. But what seems to happen right now is that the structures stay the same. Silicon Valley has not, in fact, abolished the checks and balances of the U.S. Constitution. In Donald Trump, may dominate sort of cultural attention through Twitter, but he doesn't actually change any laws using the internet. And this is true to some extent, even in places where the internet has pushed people into the streets, right? I mean, I think the U.S. is distinctive right now in having very little sort of mass political agitation relative to what people expected. But there are clearly plenty of case studies, from the Gilets jaunes in France to the protests in Chile, all over the world, really, where online politics does send people into the streets. And that could be a signifier that there is more transformation yet to come. But even there, what distinguishes these movements is their sort of inchoate resentments with the status quo, their lack of effective leaders, and, again, their sort of almost symbiotic relationship with this establishment that they dislike. So, you have protests as sort of a safety valve for popular discontent, but you don't have, a clear revolutionary program. The Gilets jaunes, can sort of keep Paris in a state of constant disturbance, but they can't actually topple Macron's government and so on. So I don't rule out that there could be some real political revolutions driven by the internet at some point, maybe even some point soon. But for now, it seems to be sort of keeping us stuck where we are in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that one of the crucial arguments of the book is that material prosperity and the kind of technological advances that we're talking about here, they've actually enabled decadence because they've stabilized it. I mean, hence the book's subtitle.
Yes, and I mean, I think I spend a certain amount of time talking about the idea of sustainable decadence as something that could be the reality of the developed world for quite some time to come. And this is, I think, something that people don't use the term sustainable decadence. I don't think they're going to adopt it from my book. But there is, I think, a part of the not the consensus view, but a pretty common elite level view in the Western world would be something like that idea that basically, you have countries that have achieved sort of a maximum of wealth and growth and dynamism that we can achieve, at least so long as we remain an earthbound species. And therefore, the thing to do is to sort of try and steward and maintain the stability of the system, even as societies get older and creak a bit, to figure out how to integrate just enough immigrants to keep the labor markets running, and to sort of try and usher countries that haven't yet converged with us completely successfully into our sort of stable, decadent moment. And then this too, I think, interacts with climate change anxieties, right? Where there's sort of a dynamist view of climate change that says we need to sort of innovate our way through so that we can, have growth beyond what we achieve today, but also have it be green and clean energy and so forth. But then the other view that I think is pretty commonplace is that, in fact, a certain kind of stagnation is a good thing insofar as it, prevents carbon emissions from soaring too high. And wouldn't it be good if China could just sort of accept a slightly lower rate of growth than they're heading for? And that, of course, shades into sort of the more, frankly, austerity-focused vision of a Greta Thunberg or someone like that. But you don't have to go all the way to Greta to find a lot of people who think, that we've gotten rich and now the key is to redistribute effectively and prevent ourselves from, despoiling the earth too much. And I mean, there's a book out by an economist named Dietrich Vollrath that just came out in January called Fully Grown: Why a Stagnant Economy is a Sign of Success. And it's quite a good book, and it makes it, again, a pretty plausible argument that, this is sort of an end point and we're just going to be stuck here for a while and we should be happy with it because it means we've succeeded insofar as we can succeed.
So you also talk about this in a cultural sense, Hollywood rebooting film franchises and so on. But you also talk about the social impact. For example, you identify how the opioid crisis seems to have crushed America's revolutionary enthusiasm in many ways. So this is kind of something that you consider in the broadest possible way.
Yes, I think decadence extends in our own era across a pretty wide range of cultural and economic forces. And I think you have a lot of interaction between those forces. For instance, I think you can see it pretty clearly in the interaction between declining birth rates, slowing economic growth, and political stalemate, that as societies get older, they are less amenable to reform and transformation, which in turn helps to make them more stagnant. And as they become more stagnant, people are less likely to have kids. And so the society becomes older. And so the cycle continues. But then I think there's also, a dynamic of kind of de facto stabilization that happens where sometimes sort of organically and sometimes with some encouragement from above, people in societies like ours seem to seek out forms of sort of numbing escape from a world in which, seems to lack definite purpose and direction. And so you end up with a world where, our drug crises, whether they are crises of legal or illegal drugs, or whether they're drugs that we don't now consider crises at all, like marijuana that we're in the process of legalizing, they're all or mostly all drugs that are not sort of driving, excitement and acting out. They're drugs that tend to, make people chill. And in the case of opioids, sort of numb their pain and have them drift away day by day. And there's a touch, it's not, I don't want to overstate it, but there's a touch of the Aldous Huxley Brave New World destination here, where you have, he has the feelies and soma, and we have, endless online pornography, opioids, pot, and antidepressants. And again, we're not in that dystopia, but if you were charting our dystopian direction, that's the direction we're taking, sort of towards the Brave New World endgame rather than a 1984 scenario.
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that I like about this book is that it's not very black and white, that you're not saying that everything is terrible. Because, for example, even on something like Hollywood, yes, there may be a sense that Hollywood is going through a stagnant period, yet at the same time we're living through a golden age of television, in contrast, that a lot of the originality and creativity seems to have transferred to that medium. Even in politics, as you say, there are worrying aspects going on, yet there's more engagement with politics, arguably more creative thinking in politics going on now than there was kind of a generation earlier. So how do you, even as a writer thinking about these things, how do you go about balancing your arguments and yet still being able to make the very clear argument that you are?
I mean, I think that the balance that I'm trying to strike is the view that there is, one, as you say, exceptions to decadence, but two, that there's lots of discontent with decadence and rebellions against it. And that's, I think, more true today than it was when I started working on this book. And I actually started working on it quite a while ago. I was sort of sidetracked by both some personal stuff and by the need to write a book about Pope Francis, which you were kind enough to have me on to talk about. But over the last 7 years, I think you can see in the rise of populism, the appeal of socialism, sort of people who want political transformation and realignment more than they seemed to want it when it was George W. Bush versus Al Gore, or even Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney, right? And you've seen something like Brexit actually take place in the UK, which, you know, whether you're for it or against it, it's a sign of sort of political energy and life and possibility in certain ways. And it has fed into a certain kind of realignment in British politics that we'll see if Boris Johnson is able to see through. So there is, I think, this, certainly over the last 5 years or so, there's been this kind of energy of anti-decadence in Western politics that wasn't there previously, and also in intellectual debates, that there is this sort of revival of, you know, in my own world of Catholicism, there are people, you know, debating both Catholic Marxism, whether that's a contradiction in terms, and, you know, Catholic integralism, reviving the 19th century condemnations of liberalism. So there's a certain amount of real energy there that's worth sort of discussing and acknowledging. What keeps me making the broader argument rather than just discarding it is my sense that these structural forces, these sort of feedback loops creating decadence, are still powerful enough that it's hard for this discontent to successfully be translated into real dramatic change. And I think the Trump presidency has been at least a partial vindication for that view, that Trump was elected as a, you know, potentially transformative or destructive figure, and he has ended up sort of constrained and hemmed in and hobbled by all the usual forms of political stalemate and gridlock, while then enacting his more extreme self on his Twitter feed and on the internet, which is sort of, again, what you'd expect under decadence. So I think that I say something like this in the book, but I suspect that what we're seeing now are sort of the intimations of how a real transformation could happen. But my guess is that we're still a couple generations out.
Yeah, one of the really nice things about this book is the way in which the reader gets a sense that you're part of a broader conversation. For example, you explicitly cite Patrick Deneen, who we've had on the show, and there seem to be echoes of his argument that liberalism failed because it succeeded.
Yep.
In your argument that we became victims of our own success.
Yes, absolutely. I think Patrick's book is terrific. I think the distinctions between us, I suppose, are first, I mean, Patrick is a political philosopher and I am a journalist, which means that he is more likely to tell a story in which where we ended up was sort of a semi-inevitable expression of ideas latent in liberal philosophy going back to the 18th century. And I'm more likely to feel that we ended up here because of certain accidents in a way. Accident might be the wrong word, but I guess my view is that had we actually been able to go to the moon and colonize it, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about decadence right now. And that decadence gets expressed under particular socioeconomic conditions, and you need to have a certain level of wealth and technological progress to get there, but then you also need to have a sort of closing of the frontiers, which I think is sort of crucial to our own situation. And then also I think Patrick, he's I think not sort of definitive about this, but he and a lot of other people writing about the crisis of liberalism are a little more confident in the depth of the crisis and the fact that that basically we can't go on like this. And the decadent society's counter argument is that perhaps we can, right? That in fact you can enter into a period of decadence or enter into a period when sort of, liberalism has become a victim of its own success, if you want to frame it that way. And yet that period can continue for quite a while, and societies can sort of persist with contradictions and forms of futility and all kinds of levels of disappointment longer than you might expect from just reading Twitter.
Yeah, it very much reminded me of Francis Fukuyama's often misunderstood argument about the end of history, that it would be a sad time, that there seems a definite connection there with this sense of stagnation and kind of almost ennui. But it is intriguing because at the end you do say that decadence might come to an end, and you present us with these kind of two possibilities. That it may end either through catastrophe, yes, coronavirus, we're looking at you, or some kind of renaissance. So maybe just outline for us what those might involve.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, catastrophe I think is sort of the obvious one, and I do mention pandemics. I sadly did not write an entire chapter about the risks of pandemics, but at least they're in there, and it's interesting experience to promote a book about decadence while, the decadent world is actually experiencing a genuine crisis. But I think the scenarios that I sketch, I think the most plausible is that climate change will have some sort of really dramatic effect on a broad belt of the world around the equator, making it genuinely semi-habitable in the way that writers like David Wallace Wells have argued, and that this will then sort of interact with the very striking population imbalances between a hyper-decadent Europe and sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, and you'll get sort of ecological catastrophe and mass migration together, creating some sort of dramatic transformation that might be truly terrible, but certainly won't be decadent anymore. So that's sort of a catastrophic scenario. And of course, the lesser one is one we may actually test with the coronavirus, where, we have had, in spite of all of our sort of polarizations and difficulties in the Western world, we haven't been tested by a financial or economic crisis for about 12 years. We don't know what economic crisis looks like in the age of social media hysteria and so on. And it's possible that the coronavirus will deliver some version of that, at least a recession, that will strain our systems quite a bit. But then Renaissance, I mean, I think my basic view is that you need something somewhat disjunctive, something somewhat dramatic to happen to get us out of the situation I'm calling decadence. And that doesn't have to be something incredibly radical. It could be something that's sort of already in the process of coming into being now. So that could be that there's some range of technological innovations that are, even now being developed, whether in energy or transportation or genetic engineering. And in 30 years, we'll look back and say, okay, the period from the 1980s through the 2010s was this sort of bottleneck. But then we emerged from it, and now we're in a new era of, radical technological change, not just the internet. So that's sort of, I think, a case study in how something could happen. I mean, I talk a bit about politics. I do think that the populist and socialist visions, that the realignments they're trying to achieve are, sort of pathways out of political decadence. And even though I'm skeptical that they'll get there, I think that they at least have a vision of a different kind of politics than the left-right stalemates that we've inherited from the 1970s. And then, of course, I think, there's always the possibility of religious revival or religious transformation. And so I'm interested both in trends within my own Christian faith, but also stuff sort of outside it. I'm interested in sort of the revival of paganism and pantheism and astrology and witchcraft in the Western world. And right now that sort of seems itself decadent, like just a form of sort of religious play acting. But you could imagine it turning into something more real and dynamic. And again, from my perspective as a Christian, perhaps quite dangerous. But so those are the kind of things that I run through. But then at the end, I get a little bit wilder, I suppose, and suggest that, the core issue here is that we really have sort of done something remarkable. We have filled the earth and subdued it we've followed the admonition in Genesis, right? So we're here. We've filled all of the space we have. I suppose we could have some undersea colonies at some point, but mostly the map is filled in, the world is globalized. It can maybe get a bit more globalized, but maybe not that much more. And in that sense, we're either at an endpoint or a threshold. And so we've either done all we can and are waiting for the catastrophe to come along, or something unexpected involving God or aliens or both is just around the corner. And I suppose I'm maybe a little more likely than the typical newspaper columnist to think that sort of unexpected and dramatic possibility is in fact a live possibility.
Yeah, it's actually a lovely moment in the book, partly because it unfolds so naturally, kind of right at the end, and is expressed in a kind of quite a personal way. But you do talk about something providential, kind of right at the end. You say, I'm not predicting the end of the world or the arrival of the millennium here. I'm just saying that if this were the age in which some major divine intervention happened, there would, in hindsight, be a case for saying we should have seen it coming.
Yes, I think that's right. I think the reverse of that feeling is people at some level know that we've come to this threshold, and they assume that something dramatic can't happen, and so it's sort of depressing. And I'm offering the optimistic flip side, which is to say, maybe you have to stand at the threshold for a little while, but you never know what might come along.
So the book is The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success. It's written by my guest, Ross Douthat, and published by Simon & Schuster, priced $27. But for now, Ross, congratulations again, and thanks for joining us on the American Interest podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard. It was a pleasure.
So that's it from us this week. Don't forget to check our website, theamericaninterest.com, and to subscribe to the show on your podcast app. The show is produced by Demir Marusik with Sean Keeley and Aram Sabarium. Do join us again next time. But for now, this is me, Richard Aldous, saying thanks for listening.